Ms. Bimbo woke up early, her mind racing with thoughts of the upcoming court day. She thought about her past mistakes and how they had hurt the people she loved. She got out of bed and began getting ready for the day. As she dressed, she couldn't help but think about Mr. Dennis. They had been together for 12 years, and she had hurt him deeply. She thought about their son, Eddy, and how her actions had affected him. Meanwhile, Mr. Dennis was also getting ready for the court hearing. He was feeling nervous and unsure about what the day would bring. He thought about Ms. Bimbo and how she had betrayed him. He wondered if he could ever trust her again. As they both arrived at the courthouse, they were greeted by the judge, a stern-looking Nigerian judge with an afro hairstyle and glasses. The judge looked at them both and began the hearing. "Mr. Dennis, why have you brought Ms. Bimbo to court today?" Mr. Dennis took a deep breath and answered, "I found out that after 12 years of our relationship, Ms. Bimbo has been seeing another man. This has led me to question the paternity of our son, Eddy." The judge looked at Ms. Bimbo, who was crying uncontrollably. "Ms. Bimbo, what do you have to say to Mr. Dennis' allegations?" Ms. Bimbo sniffled and answered, "It's true, and I'm sorry, Mr. Dennis. I feel really ashamed of myself." The judge nodded and asked Mr. Dennis, "What has your relationship been like with the child, Mr. Dennis?" Mr. Dennis thought for a moment before answering, "I've been a devoted father to Eddy. I've provided for him, cared for him, and loved him unconditionally." The judge nodded and asked, "Have you been caring for him financially?" Mr. Dennis answered, "Yes, I have. I've been paying for his education, health care, and all his needs." The judge looked at Ms. Bimbo and asked, "When did you start cheating on Mr. Dennis?" Ms. Bimbo hesitated before answering, "I've been in a secret relationship with another man for over 8 years." The judge raised an eyebrow and asked, "Why did you cheat on Mr. Dennis?" Ms. Bimbo sniffled and answered, "I don't know. I just felt okay having the other man around, I guess." The judge looked at Mr. Dennis and asked, "When did you start doubting that Eddy might not be your son?" Mr. Dennis thought for a moment before answering, "I found out about Ms. Bimbo's infidelity recently. I saw messages on her phone, and that's when I started doubting." The judge nodded and asked, "Did you confront her about it?" Mr. Dennis answered, "Yes, I did. But she just broke down and confessed." The judge looked at Ms. Bimbo and asked, "Ms. Bimbo, do you want to continue your relationship with Mr. Dennis?" Ms. Bimbo sniffled and answered, "I don't know. I've hurt him so deeply." The judge asked, "Do you wish the child was his?" Ms. Bimbo answered, "Yes, I do. Mr. Dennis is a good man, and I know he'll provide a stable and loving environment for Eddy." The judge raised an eyebrow and asked, "Don't you think the other man is the father?" Ms. Bimbo hesitated before answering, "I don't think so. Mr. Dennis has always been there for Eddy, and I know he's the better parent." The judge nodded and asked, "Who do you want to be the father of your child?" Ms. Bimbo sniffled and answered, "I want Mr. Dennis to be the father. He's a great leader, and I know he'll provide a good life for Eddy." The judge nodded and announced, "Based on the evidence presented, I hereby declare Mr. Dennis as the biological father of Eddy." Ms. Bimbo broke down in tears, and Mr. Dennis looked relieved but also hurt. The judge continued, "Ms. Bimbo, you will be required to pay child support to Mr. Dennis. You will also be required to attend counseling sessions to work on your relationship with Mr. Dennis and Eddy." Ms. Bimbo nodded, still crying. The judge looked at Mr. Dennis and asked, "Mr. Dennis, do you want to pursue full custody of Eddy?" Mr. Dennis thought for a moment before answering, "I want to do what's best for Eddy. I'm willing to consider joint custody." The judge nodded and announced, I hereby grant joint custody to both Mr. Dennis and Ms. Bimbo. You will both be required to work together to make decisions regarding Eddy's upbringing." Ms. Bimbo nodded, still crying. Mr. Dennis looked relieved but also hurt. The judge continued, "I want to make it clear that both of you have a responsibility to provide a stable and loving environment for Eddy. I expect you both to put aside your differences and work together for the sake of your child." Ms. Bimbo and Mr. Dennis nodded in agreement. The judge banged his gavel and announced, "This court is adjourned." As they left the courtroom, Ms. Bimbo turned to Mr. Dennis and asked, "Can we talk?" Mr. Dennis hesitated for a moment before nodding. "What do you want to talk about, Bimbo?" Ms. Bimbo took a deep breath and began to explain. "I know I hurt you, Dennis. I'm sorry. I was weak and I made a mistake. But I want you to know that I love you and I love Eddy. I want to make things right between us." Mr. Dennis looked at her skeptically. "Make things right? How can you make things right after what you did?" Ms. Bimbo sighed. "I don't know, Dennis. But I'm willing to try. For Eddy's sake, if not for ours." Mr. Dennis looked at her for a long moment before nodding. "Okay, Bimbo. Let's try." As they walked out of the courthouse, Ms. Bimbo and Mr. Dennis began their journey towards healing and rebuilding their relationship. It wouldn't be easy, but they were determined to make it work for the sake of their son. The sun was setting as they walked, casting a golden glow over the scene. Ms. Bimbo and Mr. Dennis walked in silence for a moment, each lost in their own thoughts. Finally, Ms. Bimbo spoke up. "Dennis, I'm sorry again. I know I hurt you deeply." Mr. Dennis looked at her and nodded. "I know, Bimbo. But I'm willing to forgive you, for Eddy's sake, if not for ours." Ms. Bimbo smiled slightly, feeling a glimmer of hope. Maybe, just maybe, they could make things right between them. As they walked on, the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a warm orange glow over the scene. Ms. Bimbo and Mr. Dennis walked hand in hand, their son Eddy's future hanging in the balance. But for now, they had taken the first step towards healing and rebuilding their relationship. And that was all that mattered.